The blood had frozen. Alara saw it first as a smear of angry crimson against the weathered gray of her cabin door, a brutal punctuation mark on a day already defined by endings. It was not the rust of a nail head bleeding in the wet air, nor the stain of crushed chokecherries. It was the color of life spilled and wasted, and it clung to the rough-hewn planks with a stubborn, icy grip. Her breath caught in her throat, a fragile puff of white against the bruised iron of the late afternoon sky. The wind, already carrying the sharp teeth of the coming blizzard, shrieked around the corners of the small homestead like a tortured soul, promising a long and bitter night. Her fingers, numb inside thin, patched mittens, trembled as she reached out, hesitating a finger's breadth from the stain. It was Thomas's blood. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. It was a final, cruel message from the man who had promised her a life of modest peace and delivered only a legacy of debt and despair. His foolish gamble in the silver mines, the whispered promises of a fast fortune from the town's smiling viper, Bartholomew Thorne, had led to this. A desperate flight, a fall from a high ridge, and now this frozen epitaph on the door of the home he had failed to secure. Beside the frozen smear, a piece of paper had been brutally affixed with the point of a hunting knife, the blade still embedded deep in the wood, pinning the notice like a captured moth. The paper fluttered weakly against the gusts, a white flag of surrender she had not yet waved. She knew the elegant, looping script before she even read the words. It was Thorne's hand, the same hand that had signed the predatory loan documents that had enslaved her husband and now, by extension, her. By right of forfeiture, the notice began, the ink slightly blurred by melting snow. This property, including all structures and chattels, reverts to the undersigned upon the death of Thomas Miller. The widow and any dependents are instructed to present themselves at my office in town by sundown tomorrow to discuss the terms of their indenture. Failure to comply will be considered a breach of contract, and collection will be executed by whatever means are deemed necessary. Indenture. The word was a slap, cold and sharp. He did not want the land, not really. This small, hard-scrabble patch of dirt clinging to the side of the mountain was nothing to a man like Thorne, a man who bought and sold futures with the flick of a pen. He wanted her. He had made his intentions clear in the weeks following Thomas's disappearance, his visits to the cabin thinly veiled assessments of his new acquisition. His eyes, the color of wet slate, had roamed over her not as a man looks at a grieving widow, but as a connoisseur appraises a piece of art he is about to purchase, his ownership already a foregone conclusion in his own mind. He saw her as another chattel, another line item on a dead man's ledger. Alara, a small voice, thin and reedy as a winter bird's call, cut through the wind's howl. Alara turned, forcing a smile that felt like cracking ice on her face. Her sister, Lily, stood in the open doorway, a threadbare shawl clutched around her narrow shoulders, her face a pale oval of concern. At 9 years old, Lily had already seen more grief than any child should. The loss of their parents to fever years ago, then Thomas's long, grim decline into desperation, and now this. "It's nothing, sweetling," Alara lied, her voice tight. "Just the wind playing tricks." She moved quickly, positioning her body to block the grisly sight on the door. She would not let this poison touch Lily. Not yet. Get back inside where it's warm. The soup will be ready soon. Lily's gaze flickered from Alara's face to the door behind her, her brow furrowed with a wisdom that belied her age. She knew when Alara was lying, but she also knew when not to press. She gave a small nod and retreated into the dim warmth of the cabin, the heavy door closing with a solid thud that seemed to seal them in with their fear. Alone again, Alara faced the notice. Sundown tomorrow. The blizzard was not a threat. It was a cage, its walls of swirling snow and ice building by the minute. There would be no travel to town, no way to comply even if she had the stomach for it. Thorne knew that. This was not an instruction, it was a taunt. He was giving her a night to contemplate her helplessness, to feel the jaws of the trap close around her before he came to collect his property in person. The thought of his fleshy hands, his cloying scent of expensive cologne and cheap cruelty, made a vile sickness rise in her throat. With a surge of desperate anger, she gripped the hilt of the knife. The steel was so cold it burned her skin even through her mitten. She pulled, grunting with effort, the blade groaning as it came free of the wood. The notice, liberated, was instantly snatched by the wind and sent cartwheeling into the graying wilderness. Alara did not watch it go. She held the knife in her hand, its weight unfamiliar but not entirely unwelcome. It was a tool, a weapon. In this world, she was beginning to understand, the two were often the same. The first thick flakes of snow began to fall, fat and heavy, clinging to her eyelashes. They were not the gentle, festive flakes of a Christmas story, but the vanguard of a mountain storm, a force of nature that stripped the world down to its most basic elements, survival and death. She stood there for a long moment, the knife in her hand, the frozen blood on her door, the jagged teeth of the mountains looming like sleeping giants behind her. She was a widow at 22, impoverished, hunted, and now utterly alone. The despair that had been a low hum in her veins for weeks threatened to become a roar, to swallow her whole. But then she thought of Lily, her pale, trusting face. Lily was all she had left of family, of love, of a world that had not yet been tainted by men like Thorn. That thought was a small, flickering ember in the frozen landscape of her heart. For Lily, she would not break. For Lily, she would fight. Even if all she had to fight with was a dead man's knife, and a wolf forged in the crucible of loss. She turned and went back inside, the cold steel of the knife a grim promise clutched in her fist. The storm had arrived, both outside and in. The cabin was a tiny island of flickering warmth in an ocean of encroaching cold. A single room, built by Thomas's own hands, it was all they had. A stone hearth dominated one wall, the fire within it a hungry, living thing that devoured the precious wood Alara had spent the autumn chopping and stacking. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A small cot for Lily was tucked into one corner, and a larger rope bed for herself in another. It was meager, but it was theirs. For now. Alara set about her evening tasks with a mechanical, practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil in her soul. She stirred the thin vegetable soup simmering over the fire, the meager contents, a few potatoes, a withered carrot, and an onion, a testament to their dwindling supplies. The blizzard would make hunting impossible. They would have to make do with what they had. She sliced a piece from their last loaf of bread, the knife she'd pulled from the door now wiped clean and put to a domestic purpose, though its other potential still hummed in her hand. Lily sat at the table, her small hands busy with a doll Alara had fashioned for her from corn husks and scraps of fabric. She was quiet, her earlier question hanging unanswered in the air between them. The wind outside was no longer shrieking. It had deepened into a steady, guttural roar, a constant, oppressive pressure against the cabin's log walls. Snow had begun to accumulate against the single window pane, a soft, white curtain drawing them into deeper isolation. "Will the snow stop soon?" Lily asked, her voice small. "It's a big one," Alara said, trying to keep her tone light. She ladled soup into 2 wooden bowls. "We'll be snug as bugs in here. We'll tell stories and stay warm by the fire. It will be an adventure." Lily looked up, her blue eyes, so like their mother's, searching Alara's face. "Are you scared, Alara?" The question was direct, stripped of all childish artifice. Alara paused, the ladle dripping soup back into the pot. She could lie, could offer a hollow reassurance, but she owed her sister more than that. She owed her the truth, or at least a version of it she could bear. "Sometimes," Alara admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes I am. But being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you have to be brave." She set the bowls on the table. "Now eat. You need your strength." They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of their spoons against wood and the relentless howl of the storm. Each gust of wind felt like a physical blow, a reminder of their vulnerability. The cabin, once a symbol of sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell. Alara found herself listening, her ears straining to hear something beyond the wind, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, the jingle of a harness, the low voices of men. Thorn's men. Her gaze kept flicking to the rifle propped in the corner. It was Thomas's hunting rifle, a heavy, long-barreled Winchester. He had taught her to load it, but she had only ever fired it once, at a tin can on a fence post. The kick of it had bruised her shoulder, and the deafening report had made her ears ring. The thought of turning it on another human being was abhorrent, a violation of some fundamental part of her. But the image of Thorn's leering face, the memory of the frozen blood on her door, chipped away at that revulsion, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. It was then that the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a sharp, percussive crack, followed by a low, splintering groan. It came from the direction of the small lean-to, where she kept the last of their firewood. Lily jumped, her eyes wide. What was that? Alara put a finger to her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. She rose slowly, every muscle tensed. She moved to the window, scraping away a small patch of the accumulated snow with her fingernail. Through the tiny peephole, she could see nothing but a maelstrom of swirling white. The world outside had been erased. Then came another sound, closer this time. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the cabin wall. It was not a knock. It was the sound of a body, a great weight, collapsing against the logs. Alara froze, her mind racing. Thorn. He'd come already. He'd brought his men, and they were surrounding the cabin, toying with her. The anger from earlier was replaced by a tidal wave of pure, primal fear. It was a cold, numbing poison that threatened to paralyze her. Be brave. Her own words to Lily echoed back at her. She snatched the rifle from the corner, her hands clumsy and slick with sweat. The weight of it was both terrifying and reassuring. She checked the load, her fingers fumbling with the mechanism just as Thomas had shown her. Lily, she whispered, her voice strained. Get under the bed. Now. And do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Lily's face was a mask of terror, but she obeyed without question, scrambling from her chair and squeezing her small body into the dark space beneath Alara's rope bed. Alara crept to the door, the rifle held awkwardly in front of her. The thudding had stopped. There was only silence now, a silence more menacing than the storm itself. She pressed her ear to the thick wood of the door, listening. Nothing. Who's there? She called out, her voice cracking. I have a rifle. There was no answer but the roar of the wind. Was she imagining it? Had the storm and her own fear conspired to create a phantom threat? A low moan answered her. It was not the wind. It was human, and it was filled with a world of pain. It was followed by a weak, desperate scratching at the bottom of the door, like an animal trying to claw its way in. This was not Thorn. Thorn would have kicked the door in. His men would have been loud, arrogant, and brutal. This was something else. This was someone hurt. Someone dying. Her internal conflict was a raging war. The part of her that was terrified, the part that had just promised to fight, screamed at her to leave the door bolted. But the other part, the part that had taken in a stray dog as a child, the part that had nursed her mother through her final fever, could not ignore the sound of suffering. Compassion warred with self-preservation. With the rifle still clutched in one hand, she used the other to slowly, tentatively draw back the heavy iron bolt. The wind immediately ripped at the door, trying to tear it from her grasp. She braced herself against it, peering into the swirling vortex of white. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a shape coalesced out of the storm. A dark mass slumped against the doorframe. A man. He was enormous. A mountain of a man clad in furs and buckskin, all of it caked with snow, and, she saw with a fresh jolt of horror, dark, wet stains that could only be blood. He was not one of Thorn's men. They were town men, soft and shoddy. This man looked as if he had been carved from the mountain itself. His head was bowed, a tangle of long, dark hair hiding his face. As she watched, he summoned the last of his strength, lifting his head to look at her. Alara gasped. She knew him, not personally, but by reputation. He was the man from the highest peaks, the one the townspeople called the Deaf Trapper, or, more cruelly, the Mountain Fool. A solitary figure who rarely came down to civilization, and when he did, he was met with a mixture of fear and ridicule. They said he was a savage, more animal than man. They said the fever that had taken his hearing as a boy had also taken his wits. His face was a roadmap of a hard life. A thick, untamed beard covered the lower half, but she could see a long, jagged scar that cut down from his temple to his jaw on one side. His eyes, however, were what held her. They were a startling, pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were fixed on her with a desperate, pleading intensity. There was no malice in them, only exhaustion and a profound, bone-deep pain. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse, guttural sound came out. He pointed a hand, a massive, fur-gloved paw, not at her, but behind him, into the storm, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed forward, a dead weight falling through the doorway and onto the floor of her cabin. The wind slammed the door shut behind him, plunging the room into a sudden, shocking silence. The storm was locked out, but something far more dangerous, or perhaps far more vital, had just been let in. The man lay sprawled on her floor, a fallen giant. He was even larger up close, filling the small space with his sheer presence. He smelled of pine, wet fur, and blood. The blizzard raged outside, but in this moment, the man on her floor was the only storm that mattered. For a heartbeat, Alara stood frozen, the rifle still in her hands, her mind reeling. Her first instinct, born of weeks of fear, was to see him as a threat. He was a stranger, a wild man, an unknown quantity in an equation already fraught with danger. But as she looked down at him, at the way his chest barely rose and fell, at the dark blood pooling on her floorboards, the fear began to recede, replaced by the same reluctant compassion that had made her open the door. He was not a threat. He was a victim, just like her, caught in the unforgiving jaws of the wilderness. "Lily, it's all right," she called out, her voice shaky but firm. "Stay where you are for a little longer." She leaned the rifle carefully against the wall, a silent acknowledgement that the immediate danger had changed its shape. Kneeling beside the man, she hesitated, then gently brushed the matted hair from his face. The scar was stark against his pale, cold skin. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a faint, wet rattle that spoke of a serious injury. She had to move him. She couldn't leave him by the door. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. It was like trying to move a felled oak. He was solid muscle and bone, an immovable object. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest, managing to drag him only a few feet, closer to the warmth of the fire. It would have to do. His furs were soaked through and frozen stiff in places. She knew she had to get them off him, to get him warm before the cold finished the job his injuries had started. Her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of urgency and a strange, unbidden intimacy, worked at the leather ties and bone toggles of his outer coat. It was made of wolf pelts, thick and heavy, and as she peeled it away, the extent of his injuries became terrifyingly clear. His left side was a mangled ruin. A deep, vicious gash ran from his ribs down to his hip, the buckskin shirt beneath it shredded and soaked in blood that was already starting to freeze. It looked like the work of a cornered animal, perhaps a bear or a mountain lion. Further up, his shoulder was twisted at an unnatural angle, likely dislocated from a fall. He must have been caught in a rock slide, or fallen from a ledge, and then dragged himself here, to the only point of light and life for miles. A wave of nausea washed over her. She was not a healer. She had tended to scrapes and fevers, but this was beyond her. Yet, there was no one else. The town doctor was a day's ride away in good weather, an eternity away in this blizzard. It was her or no one. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she moved with a newfound purpose. She stoked the fire until it roared, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. She put a pot of water on to boil, remembering some half-forgotten wisdom about cleaning wounds. From her small chest of linens, she pulled out her wedding sheets, the fine, embroidered cotton a relic from another life. Without a moment's hesitation, she began tearing them into strips. The practical needs of the present had no room for sentimentality. First, the wound. Using a cloth soaked in hot water, she began to gently, carefully clean the blood and grime away from the gash. The man groaned, a low, animal sound of pure agony, and his body tensed, but he did not wake. His skin was fever-hot to the touch. Infection had already set in. She cleaned it as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of torn muscle and tissue. She packed the wound with the cleanest strips of linen, a crude but necessary dressing, then wrapped his torso tightly with more strips, binding him up like a macabre gift. Next, the shoulder. This was worse. She had seen a farmer set a dislocated shoulder once at a town fair, and the memory of the man's screams and the sickening pop had stayed with her. She looked at the deaf trapper's unconscious face, his features relaxed in a way they probably never were in waking life. She couldn't do it. She didn't have the strength or the knowledge. To try would be to risk causing more damage. For now, she could only try to make him comfortable, propping his arm with a rolled-up blanket to keep it immobilized. Hours passed in a blur of focused activity. She managed to strip off the rest of his wet clothes, a task that made her face burn with a mixture of clinical detachment and an acute awareness of his raw, masculine form. He was a landscape of scars. Beyond the fresh one on his face and the terrible gash in his side, his body was a testament to a life lived at war with nature. Old, silvery lines crisscrossed his back, a puckered burn mark marred one forearm, and a series of small, circular scars dotted his thigh, as if he had once fought a porcupine and lost. He was not a man who had known a single day of ease. She covered him with every spare blanket she owned, leaving him stripped to his breeches, lying on a pallet of furs by the fire. She spooned a little broth and water between his lips, which he swallowed reflexively. All the while, she talked to him, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told him about the storm, about her fear of Thorn, about Lily sleeping under the bed. She spoke not because she thought he could hear her, but because the silence was too heavy to bear, and the act of speaking her fears aloud seemed to diminish their power. Finally, when there was nothing more she could do, she sank back on her heels, exhausted to her very bones. The cabin was quiet save for the man's ragged breathing and the ever-present howl of the wind. Outside, the world had vanished. Inside, a new world had begun, one defined by the presence of this broken, silent giant. A small rustling sound made her turn. Lily was crawling out from under the bed, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The scattered, bloody furs, the torn sheets, and the massive, unconscious man by the fire. "Is he a monster?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Alara looked from her sister's terrified face to the man's still one. A monster? Perhaps. The town certainly thought so. But a monster wouldn't have dragged himself through a blizzard to a stranger's door, only to collapse on the threshold. A monster wouldn't have eyes filled with such desperate, human pain. "No, sweetling," Alara said, her voice soft but sure. "He's not a monster. He's just a man. And I think he needs our help." In that moment, by naming him man and not threat, she felt a subtle shift inside herself. It was a choice, a claim. She had opened her door to the storm, and now she would face what had come inside. The first day of the blizzard passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. The second day, the man they called Silas woke up. Alara had been dozing in a chair by the fire, the rifle laid across her lap. She had not truly slept, her body caught in a state of hypervigilance, her ears attuned to every shift in the man's breathing, every moan of the wind. She was startled awake by a sudden movement. His pale gray eyes were open, and they were fixed on her. They were no longer clouded with pain and delirium, but sharp, intelligent, and intensely wary. He was like a great, wounded wolf, cornered and assessing the threat. He tried to sit up, a guttural grunt of pain escaping his lips as the movement sent agony through his torn side and dislocated shoulder. "Easy," Alara said softly, moving toward him, her hands held up in a placating gesture. "You're safe. You've been badly hurt." He stared at her, his gaze flicking from her face to her lips, then back to her eyes. He was reading them, she realized, trying to understand her intent. He couldn't hear the gentleness in her tone, but he could see it in her posture, in the careful way she moved. He stopped struggling, his massive body tense but still, his eyes never leaving hers. She knelt beside him, pointing to herself. "Alara." Then she pointed to him, her expression a question. He watched her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, with his good hand, he slowly, deliberately, tapped his chest twice. He did not speak, but the gesture was clear enough. "Me." He then raised his hand and made a fist, thumb extended, and drew a slow, deliberate S in the air. "Silas." Alara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Silas, the name felt solid, real. It was the name of a man, not a fool or a savage. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the small, tidy space, the meager furnishings, and finally, landing on Lily, who was peeking out from behind Alara's skirt, her curiosity having finally overcome her fear. Silas's expression, which had been a mask of guarded pain, softened almost imperceptibly at the sight of the child. His eyes, which had been so sharp and assessing, held a flicker of something else. Not pity, but a quiet, profound understanding of vulnerability. He looked back at Alara, then gestured with his chin toward the window, where the snow was still a thick, impenetrable curtain. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question. How long? 2 days, Alara answered, holding up 2 fingers to be sure he understood. The storm is bad. The worst I've ever seen. He processed this, his gaze turning inward for a moment. He was trapped. They all were. He looked down at his bandaged side, then at his immobilized shoulder, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. A man like him, a man who lived by his physical strength and competence, was now utterly helpless, dependent on the kindness of a woman and child he did not know. Over the next few days, a strange and silent routine developed. The blizzard showed no signs of abating, sealing them in their tiny world. It was a world of gestures, of shared glances, of a language spoken not with the tongue, but with the hands and eyes. Alara tended to his wounds, changing his dressings, forcing broth and water down his throat. At first, he was a reluctant patient, his pride warring with his body's desperate need. He would flinch when she touched him, his muscles cording under her hands. But as he saw the steady, no-nonsense competence with which she worked, his resistance slowly faded, replaced by a quiet, stoic acceptance. He began to watch her, not just as his nurse, but as a person. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a tear in Lily's dress, the sadness that shadowed her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the fierce, protective love that radiated from her whenever she looked at her sister. Silas, for his part, was not idle. Though confined to his pallet by the fire, his mind was sharp. He communicated with a surprising eloquence through a series of grunts, gestures, and facial expressions. A tilted head and a raised eyebrow could convey a complex question. A slight nod and a softening of his eyes could be a profound expression of gratitude. He watched the fire with a critical eye, and when he saw it dying down, he would gesture impatiently toward the woodpile. He showed Alara, with a few precise movements of his good hand, how to bank the embers at night to conserve fuel and keep a steady heat. He noticed a draft coming from a chink in the logs near the floor, a draft Alara had long since gotten used to, and pointed it out with a frown, stuffing a piece of loose cloth into it with the end of a stick. He was a man who understood survival in its most elemental form, and he was, in his own way, trying to protect them, even in his weakened state. The pivotal moment, the act that shattered the last of Alara and Lily's fear, came on the 3rd day. The temperature in the cabin had dropped, the fire fighting a losing battle against the relentless cold seeping through the walls. Lily, huddled in her thin shawl, was shivering, her lips tinged with blue. Silas saw it. He had been watching the child with a quiet, steady intensity. He made a low sound in his throat to get Alara's attention, then pointed to Lily, his face a mask of concern. He then looked down at the heavy wolf pelt coat that lay in a heap near the hearth, the one Alara had stripped from his body. It was dry now. He gestured toward it, then back to Lily, a clear and unmistakable instruction. Alara hesitated. The coat was immense, heavy, and smelled faintly of the wild. But the command in Silas's eyes was absolute. She retrieved the coat, and, following his silent direction, wrapped it around Lily's small frame. The child was instantly swallowed by the thick fur, disappearing into its depths until only the top of her head was visible. Lily giggled, a sound that had been absent from the cabin for days. She snuggled into the warmth, her shivering subsiding almost immediately. "It's like being hugged by a bear," she whispered, her voice muffled by the fur. Alara looked at Silas. He was watching Lily, and for the first time, a genuine smile crinkled the corners of his eyes, erasing some of the harshness from his face. It was a small act, a simple gesture, but it was a moment of profound and unexpected gentleness. He had given the child the best of what he had, the very coat that was his primary protection against the elements. In that moment, he ceased to be the deaf trapper or the mountain fool. He was simply Silas, a man who understood the cold, and who would not see a child suffer from it. He was not a monster, he was a protector. The realization settled in Alara's heart, warm and solid. That night, as the storm raged its fiercest, a different kind of quiet settled in the cabin. It was no longer the silence of fear and mistrust, but the silence of shared space, of a fragile truce that was slowly blossoming into something akin to trust. Lily, refusing to give up the wolf pelt, fell asleep in its warm embrace, looking like a tiny bear cub hibernating for the winter. Alara sat by the fire, mending one of Silas's torn buckskin shirts. The needlework was rough, but it was functional. She was aware of his eyes on her, but the feeling was no longer unsettling. It was just watchful. Unable to bear the one-sided silence any longer, she began to talk. She spoke softly, her voice a counterpoint to the wind's howl, not expecting a response, but needing to fill the space with something other than her own anxious thoughts. His name was Thomas, she began, her fingers stilling on her work. He was a good man, I think. Where he wanted to be. He got lost. This land, this life, it was harder than he expected. Harder than I expected. She told Silas everything. She told him about their dreams of a life away from the soot and grime of the eastern cities, about the promises of the frontier that had turned to dust in their hands. She told him about the failed crops, the harsh winters, the slow erosion of Thomas's hope. And then she told him about Thorn. She spoke his name like a curse, her voice dropping, hardening. She told him about the loans, the veiled threats, the way Thorn's eyes made her skin crawl. She told him about the notice on the door, about the frozen blood, about her certainty that Thorn would come for her as soon as the snow cleared. She poured out the whole, ugly story, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of grief and fear and anger that she had held inside for too long. When she was finished, she was crying, silent tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. She felt raw, exposed, and foolish for having burdened this stranger with her troubles. She looked up at Silas, expecting to see pity, or perhaps boredom, in his eyes. Instead, she saw a deep, resonant empathy. He had listened, not with his ears, but with his entire being. He had watched her face, her hands, the tension in her shoulders, and he had understood everything. He reached out his good hand, not to touch her, but to the hearthstone between them. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire. On the smooth, flat stone, he began to draw. His hand, though large and calloused, moved with a surprising delicacy. He drew a small, simple picture of a house, with smoke curling from the chimney. Then he drew a stick figure of a man, a woman, and a small child holding hands. He pointed to the drawing, then tapped his own chest, a look of profound sadness on his face. Then, he drew flames engulfing the house. He drew the man and woman turning into faint, ghostly shapes, floating upwards. He left the small child standing alone. He looked at Alara, his gray eyes dark with memory, and pointed to the small, lone figure. Then, he tapped his chest again. The story was devastatingly simple, and clearer than any words could have been. He, too, was an orphan. He, too, had lost everything. He continued to draw. He drew the small boy being taken to a town, a place with many houses. He drew other children pointing and laughing. He drew a stick figure of a doctor holding a hand to the boy's ear and shaking his head. He then drew the boy, older now, turning his back on the town and walking toward a drawing of the mountains. He drew himself building a cabin, hunting a deer, sitting alone by a fire. Alara watched, mesmerized, as he sketched the story of his life in ash and shadow. The story of the fever that had stolen his hearing, of the cruelty of a world that had no patience for difference, of his retreat into the solitude of the wilderness. He was not a fool who had chosen this life. He was a survivor who had been given no other choice. He had not abandoned the world had abandoned him. When he was finished, he looked at her, his expression vulnerable, stripped bare. He had shared his own story of loss and isolation, a silent answer to her spoken one. In that moment, by the flickering firelight, surrounded by a world-ending storm, the grieving widow and the deaf trapper were no longer strangers. They were two broken pieces of a hard world who had, against all odds, found a moment of perfect, silent understanding. He reached out and gently, with the pad of his thumb, wiped a tear from her cheek. The touch was light as a feather, but it landed on her skin like a brand, a promise of a connection deeper than words. The blizzard broke on the 5th day. It did not end with a gentle tapering, but with a sudden, dramatic cessation. The wind died, and a profound, ringing silence fell over the land, a silence so complete it felt louder than the storm that had preceded it. The sun, a stranger for nearly a week, broke through the clouds, striking the new-fallen snow with a light so brilliant it was blinding. Alara stood at the door, squinting against the glare. The world was transformed, buried under a blanket of white so deep it erased all landmarks. The trees were heavy-laden, their branches bowed in supplication. It was a scene of pristine, virginal beauty, but Alara felt no joy in it. She knew that the melting of this snow would be like the turning of a key in a lock, releasing Thorn from his temporary prison in town and setting him on the path to her door. Behind her, Silas was on his feet. He had been testing his strength for the past day, moving around the small cabin with a slow, deliberate gait. The fever had broken, and though his face was still pale and drawn, the raw, indomitable strength of the man was beginning to reassert itself. His side was still tightly bound, and his left arm was in a crude sling Alara had fashioned, his shoulder a knot of angry, swollen muscle that would need more than her meager skills to fix. But he was mobile, and he was watching the new, sunlit world with an entirely different kind of focus. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the sun. He sniffed the air, his senses, sharpened by the loss of his hearing, taking in information she could only guess at. He scanned the horizon, his gaze lingering on the low pass that led back towards town. He looked at Alara, his expression grim. No words or drawings were necessary. They both knew what the thaw meant. The fragile domesticity of their snowbound days was over. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress waiting for a siege. And Silas, the wounded guest, underwent a transformation. He was no longer a patient, but a commander. His first act was to take the rifle from her. He held it in his good hand, his touch expert and familiar. He worked the action, checked the chamber, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked at the small box of cartridges on the mantelpiece, fewer than 20, then back at her, a question in his eyes. "Is this all?" Alara nodded, a fresh wave of hopelessness washing over her. Thomas was not much of a hunter. Silas's jaw tightened. He propped the rifle near the door and began a slow, methodical survey of the cabin, his eyes missing nothing. He was no longer seeing it as a home, but as a defensible position. He tested the sturdiness of the door, the lock on the window shutter. He ran his hand along the log walls, searching for weaknesses. His movements were economical, purposeful. The gentle giant who had smiled at Lily was gone, replaced by an apex predator preparing its den for an attack. Lily, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, was quiet and subdued, staying close to Alara's side. She watched Silas with a mixture of awe and fear. He was their protector, but there was a frightening intensity to him now, a barely suppressed violence that hummed just beneath the surface. Later that morning, they received the warning they had been dreading. A figure on horseback appeared, struggling through the deep drifts. It was Dr. Miller, the town's only physician, a kind, elderly man who had brought both Alara and Lily into the world. He was leading a second horse, laden with supplies. "Alara, thank God," he breathed, his face ruddy from the cold, his white whiskers frosted. "I was worried sick. The whole town is buried, but I knew you were isolated out here." He dismounted, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. Alara, looking pale and grim, and the enormous, scarred figure of Silas standing silently in the doorway behind her. "Silas," the doctor said, his voice holding a note of surprise. "I heard you were caught out. Figured you were a goner." Silas just nodded, his gaze fixed on the path the doctor had made through the snow, the path that led back to town. "I can't stay long," the doctor said, untying the supply bags. "But I brought what I could. Flour, salt pork, some medicine. And a warning." He lowered his voice, his eyes grave. "It's Thorn. He's lost his mind." He was strutting around the saloon all through the storm, bragging to anyone who would listen that as soon as the snow cleared, he was riding out here to claim his property. He's hired a half-dozen rough men, drifters, and failed miners from the look of them. "They're not lawmen, Alara. They're thugs." The doctor looked from Alara's terrified face to Silas's stony one. "You need to get out of here. Both of you. Take Lily and go. Head north, over the pass. Don't go back to town. Thorn has the sheriff in his pocket." There'll be no help for you there. Alara's heart sank. We can't, she said, her voice a whisper. We wouldn't make it a mile in this snow. And he's hurt. She gestured toward Silas. Dr. Miller's professional gaze took in Silas's sling and the way he held himself, favoring his side. He stepped closer. Let me see. Silas was reluctant, but at a nod from Alara, he allowed the doctor to examine him. The doctor's face grew grim as he looked at the dislocated shoulder. This has been out for days. It needs to be set, and soon, or you'll lose the use of the arm for good. He looked at the makeshift dressing on Silas's side. And this needs stitching. Now, what followed was a brutal, medieval piece of surgery on the cabin floor. The doctor produced a flask of whiskey. Drink this, he told Silas. All of it. Silas looked at the flask, then at the doctor, and shook his head. He pointed to his own temple. He needed his mind clear. He gestured to a piece of firewood. The doctor, understanding, wedged it between Silas's teeth. Bite down on this. Alara, you and I will have to hold him. Alara, her stomach churning, knelt and pressed down on Silas's legs. The doctor, surprisingly strong for his age, grabbed Silas's wrist and shoulder. On 3, he grunted. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. With a sudden, violent wrench, he pulled and twisted. There was a sickening, wet pop, a sound of bone and sinew grinding back into place. Silas did not scream. A strangled, inhuman roar was ripped from his throat, muffled by the wood between his teeth. His entire body arched off the floor, a massive, convulsive spasm of pure agony. The piece of firewood splintered under the pressure of his jaw. His eyes, screwed shut in pain, flew open, and for a terrifying second, they were the eyes of a wild animal, devoid of all reason. Then, as the initial wave of agony subsided, he collapsed back, his body drenched in sweat, his breathing coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. He spat out the splintered wood and looked at the doctor, then at Alara. In his pain-filled eyes, there was a flicker of gratitude. He could move his fingers. The arm was saved. There was no time to rest. The doctor, his face set, threaded a needle. This will hurt, too, he said unnecessarily, as he began the rough work of stitching the gash in Silas's side closed. Silas endured it with a stoicism that was both admirable and terrifying. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, just stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched, his good hand gripping a log from the woodpile so tightly his knuckles were white. When it was done, the doctor packed his bag. I've done what I can. The rest is up to God and you 2-inch. He pressed a small, heavy object into Alara's hand. It was a Colt Peacemaker, small and deadly. I don't know if you know how to use this, he said grimly, but you might need to learn. Thorn is a man rotted by greed and pride. He won't be reasoned with. He looked one last time at the grim tableau in the cabin. Good luck, he said, and it sounded like a prayer. He mounted his horse and rode away, a lone, dark figure against the blinding white. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken dread. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name, a face, and a timeline. They were coming. Silas pushed himself to a sitting position, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a cold fire. He looked at the rifle, then at Alara, then at the small revolver the doctor had given her. He picked up a piece of charcoal. On the floor, he drew a crude map of the cabin and the clearing outside. He drew stick figures of men on horseback approaching from the pass. Then he looked at Alara, his expression hard, demanding. He pointed to her, then to the rifle. The time for nurturing and healing was over. The lessons were about to begin. He was going to teach her how to fight. He was going to teach her how to kill. Because he knew, with the unshakable certainty of a man who had survived his entire life by tooth and claw, that soon, their only choice would be to kill or be killed. The sun climbed higher, its warmth beginning to melt the top layer of snow, turning the pristine landscape into a treacherous slush. The beautiful day was a cruel mockery of the ugliness that was coming. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. Silas gestured for Alara to bring him the rifle. His newly set shoulder was a fiery torment, and every movement was laced with pain, but he ignored it, his focus absolute. He broke the rifle down with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity, cleaning the components with a piece of oiled cloth he produced from his own pack. It was a ritual, a warrior preparing his tools. When he was satisfied, he reassembled it and held it out to her. "No," she whispered, instinctively recoiling. The heavy, dark wood and cold steel felt like an extension of the violence that was bearing down on them. Silas's expression did not soften. He pushed the rifle into her hands. It was heavy, awkward. He stood behind her, his body a wall of heat and solid muscle, his proximity both unsettling and strangely grounding. Using his good arm, he adjusted her stance, turning her sideways to the imaginary threat. He positioned her hands, one on the stock, one on the forestock, his large, calloused hand briefly covering hers. His touch was firm, impersonal, the touch of an instructor, not a man. Yet, a jolt, potent and unexpected, shot through her. He could not speak the words, so he showed her. He tapped her shoulder, indicating where to set the butt of the stock. He adjusted her head, forcing her to look down the long barrel to align the front and rear sights. He pointed to a knot in the log wall across the room. "Aim there." Her arms trembled from the weight of the rifle, from the sheer terror of what it represented. She was a woman who had spent her life creating, nurturing, mending. Now she was being taught to destroy. He saw her hesitation, the tremor in her hands. His face, which had been a mask of grim instruction, softened for a fraction of a second. He stepped in front of her and took the rifle back. He looked her directly in the eyes, his gaze intense, compelling. He tapped his own chest, then pointed to her, and then to the corner where Lily was huddled, watching them with wide, frightened eyes. The message was brutally clear: this is not for you. It is for her. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Her fear was a luxury she could not afford. Her revulsion was a weakness that could get them all killed. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about love, a fierce, primal love for her sister that superseded all else. She took a deep breath, held out her hands, and took the rifle back. This time, the weight felt different. It felt manageable, necessary. He nodded, a flicker of approval in his gray eyes. He spent the next hour drilling her, his patience seemingly infinite. He taught her how to breathe before squeezing the trigger, a slow, steady exhale to calm the heart. He taught her how to lead a moving target, using a spider scurrying across the floor as an example. He taught her how to reload, making her practice the motion over and over until her fumbling fingers became more confident, the click and slide of the cartridge into the chamber becoming a familiar rhythm. While she practiced with the rifle, he turned his attention to the cabin itself. He barricaded the single window, nailing boards across the shutter. The cabin was plunged into a gloomy twilight, lit only by the fire and a single lantern. It felt like a tomb, but Silas was turning it into a bunker. He positioned the heavy wooden table on its side, creating a makeshift barricade near the door. He took the small revolver from her and examined it. A Colt, 6 shots. He spun the cylinder, checked the action, then handed it back to her. He pointed to her, then to the gun, then to his own head, tapping his temple. "This is for close work. For when they are already inside. Do not think. Just point and pull the trigger." He made the motion, a ruthless, efficient gesture that sent a chill down her spine. As the day wore on, the preparations became more grim. Silas had her boil another pot of water, but not for drinking. He sharpened the hunting knife from the wall, the one she had pulled from her own door, until its edge was a razor-thin line of hungry steel. He placed it on the table behind the barricade, next to the wood axe. Every object in the cabin was being assessed for its lethal potential. Alara moved as if in a dream, her body responding to his silent commands while her mind reeled. Was this really her life? Was she the same woman who, only a week ago, had been worrying about dwindling flour supplies? The world had tilted on its axis, and the rules she had lived by no longer applied. There was only the rule of the wolf pack, the law of the mountain. Defend your territory, protect your young, and show no mercy to those who would threaten your survival. Late in the afternoon, Silas paused. He stood in the center of the room, his head tilted, as if listening. But he wasn't listening with his ears. He was feeling. He placed his good hand flat against the floorboards, his eyes closed in concentration. After a long moment, he opened them. He looked at Alara, his face devoid of all emotion, and gave a single, sharp nod. They were coming. Alara felt a cold dread wash over her. It was happening. It was real. "Lily," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Come here." The little girl crept out from her corner, her face pale. Alara hugged her tightly, burying her face in her sister's hair, breathing in the scent of her, a scent of innocence in a world that had suddenly lost all of its own. "I want you to go back under the bed," she whispered, her voice fierce. "And I want you to plug your ears. Do not come out. Do not make a sound. Not for anything. Do you understand me, Lily? This is the most important promise you will ever make." Lily, tears welling in her eyes, nodded bravely. "Will the bear man protect us?" she asked, her voice a tiny thread of sound. Alara looked over at Silas. He stood by the barricaded window, the Winchester rifle held loosely in his good hand. He was no longer a wounded man. He was a force of nature, a mountain spirit of vengeance waiting for the defilers to arrive. He was the savage they called him in town, but he was their savage. "Yes, sweetling," Alara said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised her. "He will." She helped Lily under the bed, then took her own position behind the overturned table. The small, heavy revolver felt cold and alien in her hand. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady. The fear was still there, a coiling serpent in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a layer of something else, a cold, hard, crystalline rage. They had taken her husband's life. They had taken her home. They had come to take her freedom, her body, her future. They would not take her sister. They would not take her life without a fight. She looked across the dim room at Silas. He stood as still as a statue, a shadow waiting to be given form by violence. He caught her eye and gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. It was not a gesture of reassurance. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of a fellow warrior ready for battle. Outside, in the unnatural quiet of the melting snow, a horse whinnied. The siege began not with a bang, but with a voice. "Alara Miller, I know you're in there." It was Thorne's voice, oily and smug, amplified by the unnatural acoustics of the snow-covered clearing. The sound of it made Alara's skin crawl. "I am a reasonable man. My quarrel was with your husband, not with you. Come out now, and no harm will come to you or the child. I give you my word as a gentleman." Silence. Silas did not move a muscle. He was peering through a tiny crack he had made in the window barricade, his one good eye scanning the clearing. "Don't be a fool, woman. That cabin is my property. You are my property. I have a paper to prove it. You cannot win." Alara's knuckles were white where she gripped the revolver. "My property." The words echoed the notice on the door, the casual, arrogant cruelty of the man. A different voice called out, rougher, impatient. "Enough talk, Thorne. Let's just burn him out." "Patience, Jed," Thorne's voice answered, closer now. "I want her cooperative." Silas shifted his position slightly, moving from the window to a spot near the door, a place where he was a deep shadow within the cabin's gloom. He held up 3 fingers to Alara, 3 of them near the front. He then pointed to the side and held up 2 more. 5 in total, not including Thorne, who was likely keeping a safe distance. The first shot came without warning. It wasn't aimed at the cabin, but at the small stack of firewood outside. A log splintered, the sound a sharp crack in the still air. A show of force, a threat. Then, the assault began in earnest. A heavy body slammed against the door, making the iron bolt groan in its bracket. Then another, and another. They were using a log as a battering ram. Thump, crack. Wood splintered. The heavy bar holding the door began to bow inward. Thump, crack. Silas was a study in deadly calm. He was not watching the door. He was watching the barricaded window. He knew they would try to divide their attention. He was right. With a crash of glass and splintering wood, the tip of a rifle barrel smashed through the boarded-up window. It poked through, blindly seeking a target. Silas did not hesitate. In one fluid motion, he raised the Winchester with his good arm, bracing it against his body. The cabin exploded with a deafening roar. The shot was fired from the hip, an impossible feat of strength and aim. Outside, there was a choked cry of pain and surprise, and the rifle barrel vanished. One down. The battering at the door intensified, fueled by rage. Thump, crack, groan. The top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame. The door sagged inward, held only by the bolt and the bottom hinge. A sliver of blindingly bright daylight appeared. Through the gap, Alara could see them, shadowy figures, their faces contorted with effort. Silas moved from the window, flattening himself against the wall next to the doorframe. He was a coiled spring, a beast of the forest waiting for the prey to come to him. He held the long, sharp hunting knife in his hand now, the rifle propped nearby. He was saving his shots. With a final, shattering crash, the door gave way, torn from its remaining hinge and thrown inward, landing on the floor with a boom that shook the cabin. Two men, emboldened by their success, burst through the opening. They were silhouetted against the bright snow, making them perfect targets, but they were not expecting what was waiting for them in the shadows. The first man, a big, bearded lout, took 2 steps inside and was met by Silas. It was not a fight. It was a culling. Silas moved with a savage grace that was terrifying to behold. His good arm shot out, the knife held in a reverse grip. It slid under the man's jaw with a wet, tearing sound. The man's eyes went wide with a look of utter shock, a gurgling sound escaping his lips as he collapsed, his life bubbling away onto the floorboards. The second man, seeing his companion fall, had just enough time to raise his pistol. But Silas was already on him. He didn't use the knife. He used his sheer, brute force. He slammed his body into the man, driving him backward into the doorframe. The sound of bone cracking was sickeningly loud. Silas grabbed the man's head in his one good hand and smashed it against the logs with a final, definitive thud. The man went limp, a broken doll. It had taken less than 5 seconds. 2 men, dead, and Silas was already turning, his pale eyes scanning for the next threat, his chest heaving, not with exhaustion, but with a primal, adrenaline-fueled rage. He was the cornered grizzly, lethal and absolute. A third man appeared in the doorway, more cautious than the others. He saw the carnage inside and hesitated, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. He raised his rifle. From behind her barricade, Alara screamed, a wordless cry of pure terror and fury. She raised the revolver, her hands shaking violently. She remembered Silas's silent instruction. Don't think. Just point and pull. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The kick of the small gun surprised her, bucking in her hand. The shot went wide, burying itself in the log wall over the man's head. But it had been enough. Her action had drawn his attention. He turned his rifle toward her, his face a snarl. In that split second of distraction, Silas moved. He lunged forward, grabbed the barrel of the man's rifle, and ripped it from his grasp. With a powerful twist, he used the rifle itself as a club, smashing the heavy wooden stock into the side of the man's head. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious but alive. 3 down, 2 to go. Jed, Sam, what's going on in there? It was the voice of the fourth man, from the side of the cabin. A moment later, a flaming torch was tossed through the broken doorway, landing on the dry rushes on the floor. They were trying to burn them out. Flames licked up, greedy and fast, smoke beginning to fill the room. The child, Alara screamed, her training forgotten, her only thought the fire and Lily under the bed. Silas did not panic. He kicked the burning rushes toward the stone hearth, his heavy boots stamping out the worst of the flames. But more embers caught, and the smoke was thickening, acrid and choking. They were trapped. The fire was growing, and there were still 2 men outside, plus Thorn. Then, Alara saw it. The fourth man, emboldened by the fire, was creeping around the side of the cabin, trying to get a clear shot through the doorway. He was exposed. Silas, she screamed, pointing. Silas didn't need the warning. He had already seen him. He snatched up the Winchester again. He had 1 shot, maybe 2. He raised the rifle, but his injured side spasmed. Pain shot through him, and his aim wavered. The man outside saw his chance and brought his own gun up. This was it. This was the moment. Alara did not think. She acted. She rose from behind her barricade, the revolver still in her hand. She was a clear target, but she didn't care. She leveled the gun with both hands, just as Silas had shown her, and focused on the front sight. She saw the man's chest, a broad, inviting target. She remembered to breathe out. The world seemed to slow down. She saw the flash from the man's rifle as he fired at Silas. She saw Silas stumble backward, a cry of pain torn from him, and she squeezed the trigger. Boom. The man outside jerked, a red flower blooming on his cheap wool coat. He looked down at his chest with a comical expression of surprise, dropped his rifle, and fell face first into the snow. Alara stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of her gun, her ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had done it. She had taken a life to save a life. The woman she had been was gone forever, burned away in that single, deafening moment. In her place stood a survivor, a protector, a killer. A groan from the floor brought her back. Silas was down. He was clutching his good shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. The bullet had hit him. Through the smoke and chaos, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was Bartholomew Thorne. He held a small, pearl-handled derringer, and his face was a mask of rage and disbelief. His hired muscle, his wall of paid courage, was gone, leaving him exposed and alone. He surveyed the scene, the bodies, the blood, the smoldering fire, and his eyes finally landed on Alara, standing with the smoking gun in her hand. "You," he hissed, his civilized veneer stripped away, revealing the petty, vicious tyrant beneath. "You stupid, worthless creature. Look what you've made me do." This was all supposed to be so simple. He saw Silas, wounded on the floor, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "And you?" he sneered, kicking the hunting knife away from Silas's reach. "The mountain fool. I should have known you'd be involved. A match made in heaven. The wild animal and the broken whore." Alara felt a rage so pure and hot it burned away the last of her fear. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Thorne laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Get out? My dear, I have just arrived. This is my house. You are my property, and I always collect what is mine." He raised the derringer, pointing it not at Alara, but at Silas's head. "Now drop the gun, or I'll put this animal out of its misery for good." Alara's eyes flicked from Thorne's triumphant face to Silas, helpless on the floor. She still had 4 shots, but Thorne was close, and the derringer was a breath away from Silas's temple. It was a standoff she couldn't win. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her arm and let the heavy revolver thud to the floor. "Excellent," Thorne said, his smile widening. He took a step into the room, his eyes devouring her. "You see? In the end, everyone is reasonable." He gestured with his gun toward the smoldering fire. "A pity about the mess. We'll have to have it cleaned. But first," he never finished the sentence. From under the rope bed, a small, soot-stained figure erupted. It was Lily. She had not stayed put. She had not plugged her ears. She had heard everything. And in her small hands, she wielded the only weapon she could find, a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the hearth. With a wordless shriek of a terrified child defending her family, she swung it with all her might. The skillet connected with the back of Thorne's knee with a sickening, wet crunch. His leg buckled. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and stumbled forward, his derringer firing into the ceiling as he fell. He landed on his hands and knees, momentarily stunned, directly in front of Silas. Silas, who had been playing possum. The bullet had only grazed his shoulder, a painful but not debilitating flesh wound. The moment Thorne had been distracted by Lily, Silas's eyes had snapped open, no longer pained, but filled with a cold, clear, predatory light. In one explosive movement, he surged up from the floor. He ignored the fire in his shoulder and the agony in his side. He was pure, focused retribution. His one good hand, the one that had drawn pictures in the ash and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, closed around Thorne's throat. He lifted the sputtering, gagging man from the floor as if he weighed nothing. Thorne's feet kicked uselessly in the air. His face turned from red to purple. The pearl-handled derringer clattered from his nerveless fingers. Silas held him there, his knuckles white, his face a mask of terrible, righteous fury. Alara could see the battle in his eyes. The animal instinct to snap the neck, to crush the life from this creature who had threatened his newfound family. The desire to answer violence with ultimate violence. "No," Alara whispered, the word barely audible. He heard her, not the sound, but the meaning. His eyes met hers over Thorne's struggling form. He saw her face, streaked with soot and tears. He saw Lily, standing frozen, the heavy skillet dropped at her feet. He saw what he was protecting, and he saw what he would become if he crossed that final line. With a guttural roar of frustration and control, he did not kill him. He drew back his arm and slammed his fist into Thorn's face. The blow was not the precise, killing strike of a knife, but the blunt, punishing impact of a grizzly's paw. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and Thorn went limp, unconscious before he hit the floor. Silas stood over the crumpled form of his vanquished foe, his chest heaving, blood from 2 wounds dripping onto the floorboards. The battle was over. The civilized tyrant had been defeated by the very people he had deemed savages. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of 3 people breathing. The immediate aftermath was a blur of surreal calm after the storm of violence. The smoke in the cabin began to clear, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The floor was a tableau of death and ruin, littered with bodies, splintered wood, and the detritus of a desperate fight. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of spent gunpowder. Alara moved first. She went to Lily, scooping the trembling child into her arms, holding her so tightly it was a wonder she could breathe. "You were so brave," Alara whispered into her hair, over and over, a mantra of love and reassurance. So brave, Lily clung to her, her small body racked with silent sobs, the adrenaline of her desperate act giving way to the shock of what she had witnessed. Silas stood swaying for a moment, his strength finally deserting him. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-deep weariness. He looked down at his hands, one covered in Thorn's blood, the other clean, as if he didn't recognize them. He stumbled back and sank heavily onto a wooden crate, the rifle clattering from his grasp. The grizzly had retreated, leaving the wounded man in its place. Alara, still holding Lily, went to him. She knelt before him, her eyes cataloging his new injuries. The graze on his shoulder was bleeding freely, and the stitches on his side had torn, a fresh stain of red spreading across the linen bandage. He looked drained, pale beneath the grime and blood. Without a word, she gently took his good hand. It was rough, calloused, and stained, but it was the hand that had defended them. She brought it to her lips and pressed a soft kiss to his knuckles. It was a gesture of profound, wordless gratitude, an acknowledgement of the debt that could never be repaid in words. Silas looked at her, his gray eyes clouded with pain and something else, confusion. He had done what was necessary. He had killed, and he had maimed, and he had been prepared to do more. It was the law of his world. But her world, the world of soft touches and gentle gestures, was something he still did not understand. He had expected revulsion, fear. He had not expected tenderness. The next few hours were spent in a grim but necessary cleanup. They couldn't leave the bodies in the cabin. Together, in a silent, grim partnership, Alara and Silas dragged the dead men out into the snow, laying them in a row near the edge of the clearing. It was brutal, gruesome work. Alara found herself detached, moving with a numb efficiency. She was no longer the woman who had trembled at the sight of a frozen bloodstain. She had waded through an ocean of it, and had come out the other side, changed. Thorn they left where he lay, a pathetic, snoring heap of broken bones and shattered pride. They bound his hands and feet with rope. Justice, or what passed for it, could deal with him later. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, blue shadows across the blood-stained snow, the cabin was as clean as they could make it. The floor was scrubbed, the broken door propped back in its frame, and a fresh fire burned in the hearth, its warmth a fragile defiance against the encroaching night. Alara tended to Silas's wounds again. This time, there was no flinching, no resistance. He submitted to her care with a quiet stillness, his eyes tracking her movements. She stitched the graze on his shoulder with a clumsy but firm hand, her touch now confident. She cleaned and rebandaged his side. As she worked, her fingers brushed against the landscape of old scars, each one a silent testament to the brutal life he had led. He was a man made of hardship and resilience. When she was finished, they sat in the quiet, Lily asleep in her cot, finally succumbing to exhaustion. The silence stretched between them, no longer comfortable, but fraught with a new tension. The threat was gone. The thing that had bound them together, the shared enemy, was vanquished. And in its absence, a new, unspoken question hung in the air: what now? The next morning, Silas was gone. Alara awoke with a start, a sense of profound wrongness pulling her from a restless sleep. The cabin was cold. The fire had been banked, a sign of his careful hand, but his pallet of furs was empty, folded neatly in the corner. His wolf pelt coat was gone. The hunting knife was gone. The rifle was still there, propped against the wall where he had left it. A parting gift. A frantic, painful knot tightened in her chest. She ran to the door and threw it open. The clearing was empty, bathed in the pale light of dawn. But there, in the fresh snow, was a single set of tracks, leading away from the cabin, heading not toward the town, but up, higher into the unforgiving peaks. He was going home. He was a loner, a man of the wilderness. His duty was done. He had protected the den, driven off the predators. Now, he was retreating back to his solitude, back to the world where he belonged. He had entered her life like a storm, and like a storm, he was now passing. Alara stood in the doorway, the freezing air biting at her skin, and felt a desolation deeper than any she had felt before. It was not the despair of a victim. It was the grief of a survivor, facing a new and unexpected loss. In the crucible of violence, something new had been forged between them, a bond of trust, of mutual protection, of silent understanding. And now, he was walking away from it. She thought he was leaving because he believed he had no place here, in this world of homes and hearths and families. He saw himself as the savage, the animal, fit only for the wild. He had saved her life, but he didn't believe he was worthy of sharing it. The townspeople had called him a fool. They had been wrong. The fool was anyone who would let this man go. A fierce, unshakable resolve settled over her. She had not survived Thorn and his thugs only to surrender to a quiet, lonely future. She had fought for her life, and now she would fight for the life she wanted. "Lily," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority. "Wake up. We're going for a walk." She dressed herself and her sister in their warmest clothes. She packed a small satchel with the last of their bread and a skin of water. She took one last look around the battered cabin, her home, her fortress, her cage, and then she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. She did not take the rifle. This was not a hunt. It was a plea. She found Lily's hand, and together, the woman and the child began to follow the lone set of tracks, climbing up into the high, silent world of the man who had saved them, the man they were now determined to save from himself. The tracks were easy to follow in the deep snow. Silas was not moving fast. He was injured, his body protesting the ordeal of the past week. He was also, Alara suspected, reluctant. His path wasn't a straight, determined line away from them, but a slow, meandering trail, as if he were fighting his own instincts with every step. He was a wolf, conditioned to run alone, but some part of him, she prayed, now yearned for the pack. They climbed for what felt like hours, the air growing thinner, colder. The sun was bright on the snow, but it held no warmth. The world was a vast expanse of white and blue, silent and immense. Lily, her small legs tiring, began to flag. "I'm tired, Alara," she whimpered, her breath coming in white puffs. "I know, sweetling." Just a little further, Alara's own lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she pushed on, driven by a certainty that bordered on obsession. She was not chasing a man, she was chasing a future. They found him resting by a frozen waterfall, a magnificent curtain of blue-white ice suspended in time. He was sitting on a rock, his back to them, looking out over the vast expanse of the mountain range, his kingdom of solitude. He looked small against the backdrop of the jagged peaks, a lonely, isolated figure. He didn't seem to notice their approach until they were only a few yards away. He must have felt the vibration of their footsteps through the snow. He turned, his body instantly tensing, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. When he saw them, his expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, weary resignation, mixed with something that looked achingly like hope. Alara stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding. Lily hid behind her skirts, peeking out at the formidable man. This was it, the moment where words would fail, even if he could hear them. She had to speak his language. Slowly, she held out her empty hands, showing him she was unarmed, that she came in peace. He watched her, his gray eyes guarded, unreadable. She took a step closer. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched the bandage on his shoulder. It was a question, "Are you all right?" He gave a short, jerky nod, his gaze never leaving her face. Then, she did what she had planned, what she had rehearsed in her mind with every step up the mountain. She took his good hand, the large, rough hand that had killed and protected in equal measure. It was cold, and she wrapped both of her smaller hands around it, trying to warm it. She looked him directly in the eye, pouring all of her emotion, all of her desperate hope, into her gaze. First, she brought his hand to her own chest, pressing it flat against her heart so he could feel its steady, frantic beat. "My life," the gesture said. "You saved my life." Then, she guided his hand to Lily, who had crept out from behind her. She placed his hand on the top of Lily's head, a gentle, paternal benediction. "Her life. Her future. You saved her." Finally, with tears streaming down her face, she led his hand away from Lily and pointed with it. Not up, toward the lonely peaks where he lived, but down the mountain, back in the direction of the small, battered cabin that sat in the clearing below. She pointed toward the thin, wavering column of smoke that still rose from its chimney. She pointed to home. She looked back at him, her face a mess of tears and desperate pleading. She tapped his chest, then her own, then pointed again to the cabin. "You, me, home." It was a proposal, a promise, a prayer, all wrapped up in one silent, desperate plea. "Stay?" Silas stood as still as the frozen waterfall behind him, his face a mask. He looked from Alara's tear-streaked face to Lily's wide, hopeful eyes. He looked at his own hand, still held in Alara's, and then down the mountain toward the smoke, toward the small cabin that represented everything he had lost, everything he had never believed he could have again. For his entire adult life, he had been an outcast, the mountain fool, a creature of the wild, more animal than man in the eyes of the world. He had accepted it, embraced it even. Solitude was safe. Solitude could not betray you, could not mock you, could not break your heart. But this woman, this fierce, resilient woman, she did not see the fool or the savage. She saw him. She had looked into the darkest parts of him, had seen him kill without hesitation, and she had not run. She had healed him, she had fought beside him, and now she was asking him to stay. She was offering him not just a place to live, but a place to belong. She was offering him a pack, a family. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was a betrayal of a lifetime of stoicism, a crack in the armor he had so carefully built around his heart. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand from hers. For a heart-stopping moment, Alara thought she had lost, that he was rejecting her plea. Her heart plummeted. But he did not turn away. Instead, he reached up and gently, with the rough pad of his thumb, he wiped the tears from her cheek, just as he had done by the firelight what felt like a lifetime ago. Then, he looked at Lily, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. He knelt, wincing from the pain in his side, until he was at her level. He held out his hand, palm up. After a moment of hesitation, Lily placed her small, mittened hand in his. He closed his hand gently around hers, then rose to his full, towering height, still holding the child's hand. He looked at Alara, his pale gray eyes full of a raw, powerful emotion she could not name, but that filled her with a soaring, impossible hope. He did not need to draw in the ash. He did not need to make a gesture. His choice was clear. He turned and began to walk, not up into the peaks, but down the mountain, back the way they had come. He walked slowly, carefully, leading Lily by the hand, his big, lumbering gait a perfect match for her small, shuffling steps. He was leaving his kingdom of ice and stone and walking toward the promise of a warm hearth and a shared life. Alara stood for a moment, watching them go, the man, the child, a new and unlikely family unit etched against the vast, white canvas of the mountains. Then, with a laugh that was half a sob, she ran to catch up, falling into step beside him. She slipped her hand into the crook of his injured arm, not to support him, but to be supported by him, to anchor herself to this new reality. They walked in silence, the three of them, a single unit moving through the snow. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was full of promises made and accepted, of a shared past of violence and a shared future of hope. The deaf trapper was no longer alone. The grieving widow was no longer a victim. The orphaned child had found a father. Together, they walked down the mountain, toward the smoke, toward home. Section Dash. Spring came to the high country, not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent, messy birth. The snows melted in a torrent, swelling the creeks and turning the clearings into muddy quagmires. But with the thaw came life. Patches of stubborn green appeared on the forest floor, and the stark, skeletal branches of the aspen trees began to fuzz with the promise of new leaves. The cabin, too, had been reborn. The splintered door had been replaced with a new one, thick and solid, built by Silas's own hands. The broken window had new glass, painstakingly brought up from town. The scars of the battle remained, a dark stain on the floorboards that would never quite fade, a pockmark in the wall from a stray bullet, but they were no longer symbols of terror. They were reminders of what had been survived, foundations of the peace that had been earned. The law had come, eventually. A grim-faced sheriff and his deputy had ridden up weeks after the battle, having finally heard the news of Thorne's demise. They found Thorne's body, and the bodies of his men, preserved by the cold. They found Thorne himself, alive but broken, his mind addled by his injuries and the cold, muttering incoherently about property and contracts. They listened to Alara's story, their faces impassive. They looked at Silas, at his formidable size and the scars that told his history, and they looked at Alara, at the cold steel in her eyes that had not been there before, and they made a practical, frontier decision. Thorne had hired thugs and attacked a widow on her own land. He had gotten what he deserved. The official report would be simple, self-defense. Thorne was hauled away to face whatever justice awaited a man whose wealth could no longer protect him. The matter was closed. Life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of partnership. Silas was a man of the earth, and he brought the earth back to life. He cleared new ground for a larger garden, his powerful arms making short work of rocks and roots. He taught Alara the signs of the forest, which mushrooms were safe, where the deer would browse at dawn, how to read the clouds for a coming rain. He was a silent teacher, his lessons taught by example, by a pointed finger, by a shared look of understanding. Section Dash. Alara, in turn, brought him into the world of the home. She taught him the comfort of a hot meal at the end of a long day, the simple pleasure of a mended shirt, the warmth of a shared blanket. She found that she still talked to him, her voice a constant, low murmur as she went about her day. She no longer did it to fill the silence, but because he listened. He would watch her, his head cocked, his eyes focused on her face, and she knew he was understanding more than just her words. He was learning the music of her emotions, the cadence of her joy and her sorrow. He learned to read and write. It was Lily who started it, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. Ly, Silas watched, fascinated. He picked up a piece of charcoal, and with the same intense concentration he applied to tracking a deer, he began to copy the strange symbols. Alara brought out an old primer, and their nights by the fire were spent with their heads bent together over the book, her finger guiding his as he sounded out the shapes of this new, magical language. C-E-T, H-L-E-M-E, L-O-V. Each new word he mastered was a brick in the bridge he was building between his silent world and theirs. One evening, as the last of the sun's rays painted the peaks in hues of rose and gold, Alara was standing in the doorway, watching Lily chase fireflies in the meadow. Silas came up behind her, his presence a familiar, comforting warmth. He had been chopping wood, and he smelled of sawdust and sweat and clean mountain air. He handed her a small object. It was a piece of wood, whittled and sanded smooth. He had carved it into the shape of a bird, a small, delicate wren, its head cocked as if in mid-song. The detail was exquisite, each tiny feather lovingly rendered. It was the work of a patient, gentle hand. Alara took it, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. It was not just a gift. It was a poem. It was a song. It was everything he could not say, carved into a piece of pine. She turned to face him, the small bird clutched in her hand. She looked up into his face, at the familiar scar, at the kind, steady eyes that had seen her through the darkest night of her soul. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. He leaned down, and, for the first time, his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of frantic passion or desperate need. It was slow and deep and sure. It was the kiss of a man who had found his way home. It tasted of solitude and companionship, of shared loss and discovered joy. It was a silent vow, a promise of 1,000 sunrises to come, a testament to the simple, profound truth that the deepest understanding requires no words at all. The fool on the mountain had found his heart's interpreter, and in the quiet of the wilderness, they had built a life more beautiful than any sound.